Welcome to Radical Feminist Perspectives, today, 21st of May, 2023. Today, we're going to be hearing about the book Speaking Freely by Julia Penelope, discussed by Julia Long. So welcome everybody, and welcome Julia, and over to you.
Thanks very much, Joe. Good morning, everybody, or good evening or good afternoon, wherever it is where you are. It's an absolutely glorious May morning here. So, and I'm going to be speaking about this book, Speaking Freely, Unlearning the Lies of the Father's Tongue by Julia Penelope, which is an absolutely brilliant book. So I'm really pleased to have this chance to talk about it with you. This book and Julia Penelope herself, I think I think they're not possibly not as well known as they might be. Not many of us. I don't know. It'd be interesting to see in the chat. I think not many of us have read this book. Certainly, as compared to some of the other radical feminist texts of that time that we've read. So I really hope that I can do a reasonable job of trying to convey just why I am so enthusiastic about it. I think it's an absolutely brilliant piece of scholarship, and it is so relevant to today's issues of women's speech and all the kind of discussion around that. So I'm going to just begin with a little bit of biographical detail about Julia Penelope. If Joe or whoever's doing the slides, if we could just have the first slide, please. So those books there are that was just a quick picture that I took of the books either by Julia or edited by her, or co-edited by her, that I happen to have. But she was very prolific. She wrote, I think, about a dozen books, or wrote or co-edited or edited about a dozen books, as well as numerous. She gave numerous papers during the 80s and 90s. She was really prolific. I think probably the bulk of her writing was during the 1990s, and she published her last book in 1998. Very sadly, she died 10 years ago now, in 2013. She was only 71, and I think that I think she'd already died by the time I heard about this book. I hadn't heard of her at the time that she wrote the book, and by the time I heard of it, which actually was around 2013, I think sadly she had already died. So it's an absolutely massive loss to us, and I really regret that I never had the chance to hear her speak, or actually to meet her. I would have loved to have heard her speak. I can't find any if anyone can find any videos or recordings of her speaking, I would absolutely love to hear that. I couldn't find any myself on YouTube. I guess at the time she was working, it was really before all the area, now everything gets recorded as a matter of course. But as I say, she was working and writing at a time sort of really before that became very commonplace. So what I've found out about her, she does write quite autobiographically in some of her work. For example, in this wonderful book, Call Me Lesbian, she speaks quite a lot about her life and about her early life and her sort of changing thinking and analysis and politics. So some of the information I got about her, I've gleaned from her own writing. I couldn't find very much online. There are a few really fascinating obituaries about her. If it comes under some publication called the Windy City Times, I think it is. There's a collection of obituaries about her there. So if you Google her name and obituary, you'll you'll find those. But anyway, so just to to get on with it, Julia Penelope was a lesbian feminist separatist, born in 1941. She was originally known as Julia Penelope Stanley, and then I'm not sure exactly at what point she dropped the Stanley. I think we can understand the likely reasons why she did that. She was extremely active as a lesbian feminist and lesbian separatist activist. She was a co-founder of the Lesbian Herstory Archives, and in terms of her academic life, she was a professor of linguistics for a long time. I think she worked in a couple of universities in America. The University of Nebraska, I think, was one where she worked for quite a long time. And she referred to herself as a cunning linguist. She was, in terms of those obituaries, she was repeatedly described as very funny, hilarious, and having a huge laugh that would just go on and on. And so she just sounds such a fantastic woman, and lesbian and separatist, really amazing kind of big character. As I was saying, she was very prolific, but some other fascinating things that I found about her, I'm just trying to scroll down a little bit, was one of the things I love about her is that she was an avid gardener, and she created a number of gardens. She was very skillful and knowledgeable, and she also was a great she had a great passion for geology and rocks, and she would give these slideshows of her various rock collection, which apparently she would give these slideshows in darkened rooms of these rather smooth and voluptuous shaped rocks of all different kind of pink and red hues, eliciting great appreciative sighs and exclamations from the women who would attend these slideshows. So all in all, she sounds a pretty wonderful woman. So a little bit of biographical detail that I've gleaned in one of her early collections, the Coming Out Stories. She describes herself as a white working class fat butch who never passed. Now, she later very much disavowed this term butch, and she in the Call Me Lesbian collection, she talks about why she stopped using that term and rejected terms butch, femme, masculine, and feminities. She sees them all as products of patriarchal thinking. As you know, I think when we start talking about the speaking freely, I think that will become quite clear that she sees exactly where those terms are coming from. But anyway, to go back to her biography, she came out to her family at a young age, starting what she referred to as her rabble rousing. In keeping with this rabble rousing and the very, a very hostile anti-lesbian environment she was living in, the first two colleges she was attending, she was kicked out of, Florida State University and the University of Miami. She was kicked out. First of all, it was definitely for being lesbian. And there's a little bit of differences of versions online as to why she was also kicked out of the University of Miami, either for being lesbian or actually for having men in her room at the college was one of the reasons given. Anyway, I don't know about that. And I should also say that she's the only recording that I've seen of her was when she features in the film Lesbiana by Myriam Fougère, that wonderful film about lesbian separatism. And she does speak in her interview about a brief early period in her life where she refers to herself as a kept butch, which has been interpreted as being kept by the earnings, the income of a woman exploited in prostitution. So rather rather distressing information, but I think she was open in speaking about that, and we shouldn't, we shouldn't delete that as part of the history. Anyway, she, in terms of her academic career, as I hope I will convey, she was a scholar of really some brilliance and great scholarship, but she was repeatedly passed over in her academic job for promotion because of the nature of her work, which was no doubt seen by the patriarchal men with power in her institution as being a kind of, a narrow or insignificant area of interest. But also, so that's, I think, fairly predictable, but also very disturbingly and distressingly, she experienced, well, I don't really know the ins and outs of it, but what was said in terms of her lesbian feminist activism, that she became tired of the term infighting, and ultimately, as I said, she wrote her last book in 1998, and then after that, she left her academic job, and she seems to have left the whole area of lesbian feminist activism, and took a commercial job for a mainstream job with a sort of commercial mainstream publisher, and was working in that area. I think until the time of her death, but I really couldn't find any more information about that. So a really, really interesting woman, and I would love to have heard more, of her own account of, especially of those later years of her life. Could I have the next slide, please? So you might have noticed, those of you who've read the book, that in that brief account there of Julia Penelope's life, I used some grammatical phrasing that is very much the kind of thing that she herself is very critical of in this book that I'm going to be talking about in Speaking Freely. And I use them quite deliberately. These were phrases that either she'd used herself or that I'd seen other people, other women use about her. And I thought, let's have a look at the phrases we've just used and the way that they work in the story that I was giving, the account that I was giving of her life, because they reveal some very important features that she exposes herself in her book, Speaking Freely. So those phrases are: was kicked out of. I said she was kicked out of a couple of universities. Also, I use the phrase kept butch, and I also use the term infighting. So if we look at each of those in turn, we'll see what is obscured by each of those phrases and how each of those phrases function as part of what Julia Penelope calls the patriarchal universe of discourse. They are quite typical features of patriarchal language, in that they obscure power relations, they obscure the straightforward facts of a situation, and they help to obscure responsibility and agency for particular actions. So when we talk about when I talked about her being kicked out of those institutions, that's an example of using the passive voice. So instead of saying the University of Miami, or wherever it was, Florida State University, the male authorities of that university expelled her or kicked her out, I said she was kicked out of. So that puts it into the passive voice. It makes her the main topic of the sentence. She was kicked out, and it obscures who actually took those decisions, who actually was responsible for her expulsion from that university. It takes the emphasis away from them, and it actually deletes them altogether by just talking about her, rather than saying she was kicked out by whoever it was. So also in terms of this phrase, the kept butch, that is a very that is a phrase that really clouds all the kind of power dynamics and economic relationships at the heart of that, doesn't it? Because it says it's putting her in the topic position and saying that she was a kept butch. It makes it all about her particular identity. And that word kept hides all of the what's actually going on. So for a start, who was keeping her? In what manner was she being kept? And where was that? Obviously, she was kept in an economic sense, maybe in other senses too, but primarily I would say an economic sense. But we are left to interpret this for ourselves. And she was being kept by another woman who in turn was prostituted by men. But again, we've got, with that term prostituted, we've got the passive voice there. So those men who are the active agents in this, who are actively prostituting, actually serially raping a woman for and then as part of a commercial arrangement, those men are out of the picture altogether. And in fact, the woman is even out of the picture altogether. And we just have this phrase, a kept butch. And then finally, is this making sense? I'd just like to see a bit of feedback in the chat if this is useful. Okay, thank you. Because I've been thinking about this so much myself, and I know some of the terms are a little bit technical, but I just think her analysis is so important. And then this phrase, I wanted to single out this phrase where she was described as being tired of the infighting, because again, what we have in terms of this word infighting is the deletion of agency. And it kind of even more, I think, than I've tried to put them in a sort of order of how obscuring these terms are. So was kicked out of, there's some element of, we kind of know who kicked her out. Kept butch becomes more obscure. And then this infighting, what is totally obscured in that very vague term is who was doing what to whom. Who took what actions, who said what effect did it have, how did someone else respond, all the kind of power dynamics, all the politics of it is completely obscured. And we just have this very, very vague term. And what that's actually called a passive nominal. I know maybe not everyone is such a fan of linguistics or sociolinguistics as I am, but some people may find these terms a bit dry. I actually find them so satisfying because I love the way they absolutely give us a language to pinpoint exactly what is going on. So we have this really, I think it's a very useful term, the passive nominal. Nominal is when you make something into a noun, yeah, because nome from name. So we've got what is usually a verb, to fight, becomes a noun, or it functions as a noun. It becomes this vague thing, infighting, which is this noun with no agent, no active subject, no recipient, just this vague thing of infighting. And isn't this so familiar to us? This is why I picked out this word, because this is a word that I see over and over again in terms of the feminist or political communities, familiar on social media, that I see women endlessly bemoaning the infighting. Oh, this infighting is really off-putting. Oh, I'm tired of the infighting. But what this word does is completely obscure who is doing what to whom. And I think at the heart of this so-called infighting, there is always a political struggle going on which is obscured by this term, which seems to just be a general kind of free-for-all, that, oh, everybody's just all being horrible to each other. And I think in my experience, what is seen as infighting, there is always, there's invariably, I think, an act of a political attempt to silence someone else. There's always a politics at the heart of it. And then a response to that is all obscured by this term. So anyway, that's why I wanted to draw attention to those words, because you know, they're the kinds of words that we see all the time, that that I use very you know, very casually in that introduction, but they have but they really serve to illustrate what Julia Penelope is talking about in the in her analysis of patriarchal language. Okay, can I have the last slide, please? So yes, so just to make a bit more of a point about, and I think as much as Penelope, I never really know whether to, my inclination is to refer to Julia Penelope as Julia because we share the same name, which quite delights me. But I will refer to her as Penelope because I think that gives her the seriousness that she deserves. So so in as much as Penelope's work on analysing patriarchal language is known, I think probably the main thing that she is known for is her analysis of agency deletion and the way that it serves male interests, the way that it serves men's interests. So, and the famous, well, relatively famous, but certainly it should be famous example of this that she gives is this example of how we speak about this. I'm going to have to use the term how we speak about a certain scenario. We could talk about let's take a scenario where Mary is the wife or the intimate partner of a man called John. Now, the scenario that we have is that John has beaten Mary. John beat Mary. So we know exactly who the agent of that action is, this man called John. We know exactly what he's done, which is the verb he beat, and we know who the object of that action, the recipient of that action, was Mary. John beat Mary. It's very, very clear who's done what to whom. Now, if we want to shift the emphasis so that we've got John there right at the start of the sentence because it's in the active form. If we want to shift the emphasis away from John and put it onto Mary, we can put that into the passive form and say that Mary was beaten by John. So that's the passive form of that of that verb. So suddenly we're highlighting and foregrounding Mary in that sentence. If we want to really obscure who did what to whom, we can get rid of John altogether and simply say Mary was beaten. So that way it serves John's interest very well. He's nicely, not is he simply obscured, he's nicely removed from that altogether, and we are left with this problem of Mary who was beaten. Now, I don't think Penelope actually goes on to the next sentence is the one that I've put in, because I think actually this is far more common than any of those first three sentences, is that what we hear over and over again, Mary is a victim of domestic violence. So now we've got this passive, what did I call it? I've forgotten now, the nominalization. We've got the construction of this abstract noun, domestic violence. Of course, because it's happened to a woman, it has to be seen as domestic, because the language of the interior of homes is the language of woman's sort of rightful sphere, which is trivial and unimportant compared to the public realm of men. So she is a victim. It's all about her identity. She suddenly now is this particular type of person, a victim, and she's a victim of just this abstract noun of domestic violence. which now becomes, so instead of John's action, which is the issue to be addressed, it is the question of Mary's identity that has to be addressed, the fact that she's this victim, and the problem to be solved is just this very amorphous, abstract noun that we can't really pinpoint of domestic violence. And we see this kind of nominalizing of all kinds of the creation of Julia Penelope has a word for it, the creation of a topic, of a social problem. So we see it all the time, or we hear it all the time when politicians talk about problems. You know, I remember when I worked in Ireland, there was an organisation called the Combat Poverty Agency. So again, like domestic violence, you've got this construction of poverty as this kind of abstract noun. There's the removal of any kind of responsibility. The fact that some people have far more than they need and others have far less than they need, that is the product of human actions. Who dominates the public domain? Men. So it's the product of men's actions, of those men in power. It's the product of their decisions and choices. But instead, all of that is removed, and we've just got this idea of this abstract thing of poverty, which has to be combated. And we know that as long as it's phrased in these very abstract terms, we're actually never going to address it, because we're constantly it's like we're speaking with stones in our mouths. We haven't got we're not able to actually name what's going on, and so we can't begin to address the problem. And I see that it's almost 10:30 and I haven't actually got on to talking about the outline of the book, the book's content yet, but but I did think it was worth drawing attention to some of these really sort of key aspects of Penelope's analysis, because I think it's certainly not a dry book of linguistics. It's such a brilliant and really deeply satisfying read. So I'm going to give a broader outline of the book to give you a sense of the huge expanse that she covers. She goes right back to the origins of English, goes right back to the 5th century and looks at the origins of English, and then comes, right up to date in to the time of writing. I'm not going to have time to really sort of do justice to all of that, but I will try to give you an outline and a flavour of the whole book. And then if I've got time, there's a section that I thought I might read through with you, because it really shows the effect of the agency deletion and the deletion of responsibility that she talks about there. Okay, so the book then, Speaking Freely, is Penelope's analysis of what she calls of what we would broadly think of as patriarchal language, and what she terms as the patriarchal universe of discourse. In her own words, Penelope says, this is a book about how patriarchal thought controls and limits the ways we live in the world. An analysis of how the structure of English developed to perpetuate men's descriptions of what our lives are like and what the world is like. I want to understand and live in another world than the one men have made, and I hope other women will join me in its recreation. So her book is very much a political book. It's not just an analysis of language, the way that quite a lot of actually books on the English language are just like, oh, isn't this fascinating? Oh, look at this interesting sort of variation between, this dialect here and that dialect there. It's very much grounded in her lesbian feminist and lesbian separatist politics, that she wants to live in another world, and she understands that language is absolutely crucial to women's liberation, that that sort of project, or that movement of liberation. So I think first and foremost, then, it starts out as a brilliant linguistic analysis of how the English language functions as an instrument of men's social power over women. Now, as I say, she coins this term. She uses the abbreviation PUD, the patriarchal universe of discourse, to name this version of reality in inverted commas, that is created and naturalized by patriarchal language. Now, you can see there, I'm actually using, once you become aware of it, you see that we use them all the time. I'm using the passive voice there. I'm saying that this version of reality is created and naturalized by patriarchal language. Well, who creates patriarchal language? It's men. So it's the version of reality that men have created and naturalized through their language. And she opens, the book opens with the old rhyme, "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me." And I think that's very interesting that she opens with that, because at the moment, I think because of the transgender assault on women and on our language, etc., and on women generally, and their claims that, you know, if we, in inverted commas, misgender, if we accurately call someone a man, that is doing them literal violence. I think that we can be too hasty to dismiss the very real effects of language in the world to hurt and to oppress. Now, the fact that male activists, transgender activists, men's rights activists misuse that insight to say that us naming them as men is doing them literal violence. I don't think we should let that obscure the fact that language is, and it is used as an instrument of oppression. And as Penelope said, words can and do hurt us. I think we have to, I think it's really important to be clear about that and not let the misuse of that concept by trans activists kind of get in the way of that. And what Penelope says is that, you know, language is used to restrict and constrain women's freedom and to oppress us, but it's not just words, that individual words that do that. Language is a whole system of rules, with words with their semantic content, but also grammar and syntax, the way in which the whole system of language is used to constrain our thinking, and it kind of creates certain grooves that we end up thinking within those structures unless we bring them to consciousness and find a way out of them. So that's what she's talking about when she talks about the patriarchal universe of discourse. And she says, yeah, English does much more than just hinder and hurt women. It proscribes the boundaries of the lives that we might imagine and will ourselves to live. So and I actually, I haven't got time to read it now, but let me see. Actually, I will read this, because there are a couple of is it this quote? I think it's this quote that I've picked out here. She, when she talks about the effect of patriarchal language on our consciousness and our the effect on our potential for freedom, I was very much reminded of what Andrea Dworkin says about these so-called beauty standards, and the ways in which patriarchal beauty standards proscribe and constrain women, not just in the sort of physical sense through very literal physical and painful constraints on women's bodies, but also in the terms of women's intellectual freedom and creative freedom, you know, all of that. I don't remember the exact quote, but it's such a brilliant insight. And Julia Penelope says something very similar about the effect of patriarchal language. So she says, our point of view, our perceptions, our consciousness determine and limit how we describe events, objects, and people. PUD, the patriarchal universe of discourse that she goes on to describe in the book, constructs the world as men perceive it. It is a male idealized conceptual framework that defines the boundaries of sense for us, which statements make sense to us and which statements we describe as nonsense. Patriarchal assumptions structure the language we speak, and something, I think I've missed a word. The language we speak, which is the primary, and the language that we have access to is the primary mediator of our experience. The linguistic choices we make reveal much about our assumptions. So she's talking about the way in which language, she's saying, like, the way the language we have access to shapes the way that we think. It's not that we think and then we express it through this language, but it actually shapes the way that we think. And I think that it's such an important question in terms of the question of women's freedom. And I think I personally feel that we need to be giving it far more attention than I think is really customary at the moment. And something, if I can just talk a little bit about my own experience of, you know, the past few years, I feel that there is such a hunger amongst us to talk about these questions of language and to find a way of analysing. Obviously, Julia Penelope didn't live to see, you know, the absolute kind of topsy-turvy Alice in Wonderland nature of the absurdities of language that you know, are being inflicted upon us at the moment. But I feel there is such a hunger amongst women to have this very, very like to basically kind of clear a path through all of that and to have very clear, straightforward language to name what's happening. So I think on some level, certainly, you know, women still come up to me and say that they really like a YouTube video I did with the Women's Declaration a few years ago now, where we spoke about, I can't remember, I think it's myself and Stephanie, we spoke about language, and I think that really struck a chord with a lot of women. But at the same time that there is that hunger, I've also experienced, and probably others of us have as well, I've also experienced a real kind of attempt to crush and silence questions of language when we raise them. And from some of those women who've become very well-known spokeswomen for you know, gender critical movement, I've really experienced this attempt to shut up when I shut up questions of language when I raise them. So I think that's kind of an interesting, and that's the kind of thing, to go right back to what I was saying before, that's the kind of thing that often gets misnamed as infighting, but I think there's a real struggle here about clarity of language. And if some people, some women are resistant to that, I think there's definitely some kind of politics at the heart of that. Anyway, so to get on to the content of the book, so the book is the Penelope's analysis of the patriarchal universe of discourse is arranged across 11 chapters, And as I said already, it spans several centuries, which I'll try to give a flavour of, and goes across the globe. She talks mainly about English, but not exclusively. She talks about a number of other languages as well, in terms of the ways in which women are oppressed through language. And she forensically exposes the ways in which patriarchal language serves the interests of men and subordinates women. So the first couple of chapters, in the first couple of chapters, she examines the questions of the exertion of male power through looking at the origins and development of the English language. So those are really the main kind of historical chapters. In the following chapter, she establishes this her fundamental concept, the idea of PUD, patriarchal universe of discourse, and she establishes what she means through that. In the sort of middle chapter of the book, that's a really fascinating chapter where she looks at the gendering or the sexing of nouns in modern European languages. Obviously, in some languages, the languages that come from ancient Greek and Latin, we've got the sexing of nouns, you know, or the gendering of nouns as masculine and feminine, and she looks, and we, to a certain extent, we don't have grammatical gender in English, but we have what is called in linguistics natural gender, that we have sex terms that relate to biological sex. And she talks about the phenomenon of this, of particularly the grammatical gender, in really fascinating and quite revealing ways. So then in the latter half of the book, just things jumping around a bit here. In the latter half of the book, she analyzes the main linguistic modes of patriarchal language that subordinate and marginalize women. And in chapters 5 to 7, she looks mainly at the question of semantics, of the meaning content of words, and how those semantic sets serve to elevate men and to subordinate women. So, for example, one of the things that she talks about there is the fact that as soon as any noun becomes associated with women, or any noun that denotes a female or some aspect of being female, so words like girl, woman, mother, you get a whole array of misogynist language that is only that there's no equivalent for in terms of men. And obviously this is something that we're all very much aware of. So all the kinds of horrible misogynist terms associated with being female, such as I don't know, slut, slag, bitch, you know, all of these horrible misogynist terms that there is no equivalent for, there are no equivalent male terms for those. But not only do we have these semantic sets of misogynist terms, but actually the very terms themselves that signify woman also are used as insults, or as derogatory words. So, like, the word girl is in and of itself an insult, or insult is used as an insult, like you know, throwing like a girl, or you know, in the school playground, or you know, even amongst, you know, I don't know, maybe grown men, you know, this kind of this to call a man a girl or a woman is is in and of itself an insult without a need for a more kind of overtly misogynist term. And so we can think about that. If, even the term mother, I remember at school, if we were, a group of us girls were stood in the corridor chatting, a teacher would go by and say, oh, what's this, a mother's meeting? So of course the term mother then becomes this sort of derogatory term, or we have terms like, old wives' tales and things like that. So even these terms which appear to be neutral, such as girl, woman, mother, wife, they are used in this kind of negative way to derogate women. And she talks, I think it's in that chapter, she talks about how the most common paradigm of woman is the figure of the prostitute, that the way of talking about women, the most common way of subordinating women is the whole lexicon of language that refers to women as prostitutes. And I'm not going to have time to talk about all of this, but earlier on she talks about the metaphors of language. Am I going to be able to explain this? She talks about the metaphors of language which also serve this. So she talks about, I'm really jumping around all over the place now. She talks about the way that men have developed a metaphor, language as metaphor, that language is seen as a container of meaning. The way that meaning is communicated is through this container of language, and that women are also seen as containers, as the endless kind of lexicon of woman as kind of like a hole or a vessel or a sort of recipient of the male. We know what I'm talking about. Don't really want to say it in a YouTube video, but as the recipient of the penis, and the penis is the ultimate symbol of male meaning, which is then conveyed into the woman through this endless kind of construction of women as the container. The word vagina, as Dworkin points out, means sheath. So what Penelope is kind of observing is that men actually have constructed the metaphor of the language is the same, and the language itself, the metaphor of language is a woman. So woman and language are both seen as containers. And then kind of going on from that, I don't know, maybe I haven't made this point very coherently, but then woman as this container is ultimately seen as in the figure of the prostitute. That's the most common sort of semantic set of derogatory terms for women relate to that. I've really jumped around all over the place, but I've got far too many notes, and I'm not probably going to have time to go back on those metaphors. So that's why I wanted to bring that up there. So she talks about, in that, as I say, the latter half of the book, she talks about those the semantic content of language. And then in the towards the end of the book, the last few chapters, this is where I think it's really fascinating, she talks about the more of the syntax of language. So the way in which women are oppressed and subordinated, not just through the semantic, the meaning content of words, but actually through the grammatical structure of language. And so syntax refers to grammatical structure and word order, so that actually the word order, the very sort of structures, grammatical structures of our language, also serve to serve men's interests, and serve to either elevate men or to render men invisible when it wouldn't be convenient for them to be visible, and to absolve men from responsibility. And so this is where she uses these, she does this absolutely brilliant analysis of the deletion of agency and the use of the passive voice, but she uses other features of grammar as well to show how rather than foregrounding men's agency in violating or oppressing or restricting women, that is all very conveniently and very nicely obscured through the grammatical structures that probably all of us tend to use, because it's very, very difficult not to, and we use them in probably quite an unconscious way much of the time, and how this actually serves to obscure the actual situations that we need to understand clearly if we're going to do anything about them. And she gives a great example of, let me just find, she gives a really great example of this with, yeah, this, the technical term is false deixis, but I haven't got time to go into the full description of what that is. But what she says is that she talks about a particular, I don't know if it was a radio or TV program that was on the subject of a television documentary on she uses the term family rape, which again, I'm surprised she uses that term, because it's that's a very kind of a term that clouds what's actually going on. It was a program called Kids Don't Tell, and it was on the subject of father to child, I think usually girl child rape. And she looks at the way in which, and we see this over and over again in terms of TV documentaries. On one hand, these documentaries claim to shed light on an issue that has been hidden, or seen as taboo, that they kind of, the overt message is that they're going to shine a light on these you know, on these terrible things that men do. But the language that is used repeatedly actually serves to obscure the reality of what's gone on. And what she talks about is the use of the word "it" in this documentary. So I'll just give you some brief quotes from the documentary to show how the use of the word "it" veils the actions of the man and what he's done and the effects of his actions. And it actually serves to, whilst claiming to reveal the problem, it actually serves to totally obscure it. So she gives a bit from the dialogue. One of the child molesters interviewed claimed that he raped his daughter because his wife refused to engage in sex with him. And this man reported the following dialogue with his wife. I mean, we'll just ignore for the time being the disgusting argument or assumptions, the entitlement that he's making anyway. But he says to his wife, "How long has it been?" The wife says, "Has what been?" And he says, "You know what I mean." So that's already the use of "it," where it means here, how long has it, how long has it been since I fucked you, basically. But he uses this term "it" to obscure what he means. In terms of the interview with the reporter, interviews the child who has been raped by her father. The child says, "It started when I was 10." And the reporter says, you, by way of kind of encouraging the child to say more, like you'll get in trouble if you tell anyone about it. And the child says, I thought the kids at school could smell it, that they knew what we were doing. So all the time we have this noun of it. Later on, the reporter says to the father rapist, you must know what you're doing. The father rapist says, of course. And the reporter says, why does it keep happening? So anyway, I've kind of rattled through that, but I think we can see that the ways in which the acts of what the father is doing to the child, what he has been doing to his daughter, the violence, the sexual violence that he has been imposing, enacting upon his daughter, is obscured, and his agency is obscured by this use of the word it. How long has it been happening, and how will it stop? As though it is just this abstract problem that's fallen out of the sky and that no one's actually responsible for. We're nearly out of time. I'm so sorry. There's so much more to this book, but I hope I've whetted your appetite to actually go ahead and read it, because there's so much more than we could cover in this short space of the 1 hour session. But Jo, perhaps are there any questions or anything we could have a quick look at, or any comments that we could have a quick look at in the last couple of minutes?
Well, one comment is that from quite a lot of people is, can this be part 1, and could you do part 2 and part 3 soon?
I would absolutely love to, because I've got all my notes here and I've hardly touched them. So yeah, maybe I think it might be good, because the book is so much in it, maybe to do a session where she talks about the history of the development of the language, and then a session on the current sort of PUD in language. That might be a good way of doing it.
Yeah, that's great. And I mean, this is the thought from me that I mean, I think a few of us have been thinking that these radical feminist perspectives are creating a space for us to do what in maths would be thought of as pure maths. We're doing the theory, the deep theory. We're just doing, and so I'm thinking we're doing pure feminism, and you're particularly, Julia, doing pure feminism. You're really going right to the heart of what words are and the politics of words and power, and taking the time to dig really carefully into it, and some incredibly important insights come out of that. So I suppose I'd like to thank you for doing what I would say is pure feminism, and I think everybody else really thanks you for that, because you're one of the only people doing it, and Sheila Jeffries is doing it as well. But I think together we're doing it, creating a community and a space for it, and encouraging you to do more.
Thank you. Can I just say, those insights, they're not mine at all. And I've maybe added a few thoughts, but they're all from Julia Penelope. So if I've excited women about her work, I'm really, really pleased, because she really needs to be up there and read. Absolutely.
Great. Okay, see everybody next week. It's Germaine Greer. We are doing the book Germaine Greer, The Female Eunuch. So, and maybe see people in breakout rooms. Thanks so much, Julia. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks.